Okay, I'm going to zero in on the scientific and technological hacker class today because that's what Wark does in Chapter 5. Basically, the scientific and technological hacker has the potential to envision lots of new futures for us because they are the ones who understand the forces of production that we have available to us now and how to manipulate them. But most of the time, they are subservient to either corporation or to government to make a living. So they're caught in this bind where their work is not actually free. In other words, they don't have the liberty to actually think those futures, or they're actively discouraged from doing so. Now, Wark doesn't really get into like the moral responsibility of hackers, at least not directly. I tend to think a little bit more that way, and some of the books that I've covered over the last couple of years resonate in this section and kind of help me to understand it a little better. Chris Hedges, who wrote Death of the Liberal Class, book I covered, deals with how so many people in the intellectual class and in the class of what we might call creatives got sucked up into government employment and corporate employment and just bailed on their responsibility to help society with their knowledge. Christopher Lasch, who certainly isn't ideologically all that similar to Chris Hedges, wrote The Revolt of the Elites, which I've also covered, and discussed the same phenomenon, that the intellectual elites, including the scientists, the technology people, the engineers, or what Wark calls the scientific hackers, they were, to use a word Lasch wouldn't use, recuperated into the system. McKenzie Wark, by the way, I think I've mentioned this once before, but she wrote a book on the Situationist International. Debord is the philosopher who came up with the term recuperation, and it just means more or less to be co-opted, to have your liberty undermined, to be sort of sucked away into the system for money, or out of a sense of wanting to fit in, or just being tired of pushing. So when we think about it, even though we're often asked to kind of put scientists up on a pedestal and respect their authority, scientists and technology people have been responsible for, yes, a lot of the good things that we've developed and want to keep, but also a lot of the bad things that we've developed and would rather not have. Einstein develops the theory necessary for the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer actively puts that theory to use to create something we'd all be better off without. Classic case of scientists actually involved not only in developing something that turned out to be really harmful, but also very much involved in more or less lying to people and telling them it was safe. There's one video out there on the internet of a scientist actually eating or drinking DDT to show people that it was perfectly safe to use in their home. And it took Rachel Carson, who was reviled at first for writing Silent Spring, to kind of warn people, hey, maybe you don't want DDT all over your house and in your yard where your children are, being sprayed all over people without any protection. Scientific and technological folks gave us the technology to develop social media. Yeah, it's been good in some ways. I don't want to live without it. But as we all know, it has a lot of drawbacks too. And not just of the national security kind, but a lot of people are now getting depressed because social media does something to a lot of people that just makes it hard for them to deal with their life. Who gave us all that processed food? I think probably these companies hire a lot of scientists. and not just scientists to develop the flavor and the consistency of their highly processed products, but scientists in fields like marketing and, advertising that make them visually and emotionally palatable. There's a whole science behind that. Scientists and technology developers are definitely subjects of recuperation or co-optation. How Wark deals with them is by telling us a history in which there was, for a while, a class of scientists who were involved in futuring, who were thinking about how we could take this new source of human power and turn it into something fantastic. There were dreams of, people colonizing the moon and, just all kinds of ways that people could cooperate together and make the world a better place. But with World War II, there was this imperative to, to fight the Nazis, to win that war. It was a good cause, but it made it difficult for the scientific class to continue along these lines. Many of them, of course, helped out during the war and maybe didn't think as much as they should have about the long-term consequences of the development of some of their technology. And then after the war, with the Cold War and the Red Scare, it became pretty hard to be a progressive scientist or a scientist who had futuristic ideas that might sound a little communistic, because everything in America that people don't like tends to be seen as communistic. But Wark points out that it took government, in particular, it took the amount of money and the effort involved in the national security efforts of World War II to develop the technology, the science and technology necessary to later, be used in private industry in the development of corporate power. She calls that wartime socialism, because there was just an incredible amount of government control of production, and certainly the harnessing of the scientific and technological hacker class for government ends. And at the end of all that, there was a lot of scientific discovery and a lot of technology developed that then could be later used by private industry. In other words, we wouldn't be where we're at today, yet anyway, without the incredible boost that science and technology got from massive government spending. Wark argues in this chapter that neoliberalism, as we now call it, although she objects to the term, isn't a force of nature. It was a product of this historical development. And those technological advancements that we made in the 20th century are what made it possible to globalize, to build, quote, vast international supply chains, and, quote, calculate a global production system that routes around the power of militant labor in a factory in Detroit. So ironically, the technology that gets started in World War II and gets taken over by corporate power ends up being used by corporate power to hurt the American worker and workers in every other part of the world, to make labor as cheap as possible, to move employment around wherever it is cheaper. And then this system that had become global depended and depends on continuing government support and acquiescence in the monopolization of certain industries. There's all sorts of ways in which government props up corporate enterprise. Here's a quote from Wark. She says, "Capital thought it was using some new kinds of communication and computational power in its struggle with labor, but in the end, the capitalist class, too, ended up being subsumed under that power. The capitalist class became a subsidiary ruling class to the vectoralist class." That's just to bring us back to the overall point of the book. She doesn't think we're living in a neoliberal system anymore. We have this new vectorless class that has come on top of the capitalist class and is actually using the capitalist production system to draw profit from. But the vectorless class, of course, would not have come about had it not been for the development of computation, which started all the way back during World War II and during the Cold War. She says in the West, the vectoral power has so routed the working class and driven down its wages that it can no longer even consume what China manufactures. Its ability to do so is propped up temporarily by debt. And that's a point that Zizek makes as well. But now the whole system is awash in bad debt and surplus productive capacity. And at the end of the chapter, Wark says something very important and near to my heart, and I hope yours as well, which is that all of this amounts to a huge crisis for our environment, the environment that we're going to need if we're going to survive into this century and beyond. She says, once more, there is a moment in which the scientifically trained start to ask questions about the system within which their knowledge is being exploited. Only this time it's not poison gas or nuclear weapons or DDT. It's the whole process of vectoral and commodified production and consumption that is called into question. So from this perspective, what's happening now is that you have a group of scientists who are, in a sense, breaking away from standard operating procedures and actually sounding a warning cry that we need to change our means of production in a variety of ways to cut down on pollution so that we do not create more global warming and we have a chance to rectify the situation, or at least to stall it somewhat so that we can adjust. And they're warning us that we're starting to shit up our water supply with plastic. Those scientists are not all scientists. They tend to be the climate scientists. They've done enough studies that they've been thoroughly convinced, and they're trying to convince us. But we're living in a world where many more scientists and technology developers are very, very busy creating the problems the climate scientists are warning us against. This is a great irony, and it demonstrates the situation that Wark is talking about quite well. Ultimately, she wants to raise the alarm to the scientific class, to the hacker class, to say, look, now in my words, look, you have a responsibility to think beyond profit, to think beyond the comfort of your job, and to raise the alarm, and not only to do that, but to work actively to create technology of all kinds that can help us get out of this mess.